Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell, Florida State, kicking off fall camp this morning. Want to dive into some of the big storylines for this Florida State program, kind of predict some breakout performers, talk about some position battles that we are keeping an eye on. And I think the most important part of this episode is hearing from you guys in the comment section. We're going to talk a lot about this Florida State program during fall camp. What are some of the storylines that are most important to you over the next couple of weeks? That's what we're going to talk about. Appreciate you guys rocking with it again. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The Florida State fans, y'all continue to show so much love, so much support to the fellas. I can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with some of the position battles that we are keeping an eye on. And a lot of these position battles are kind of just determining the pecking order that we have for Florida State. I want to start in the wide receiver room. I think one of the most fascinating position groups on this Florida State program, where you're going to see a lot of casual college football fans look at Florida State's pass catcher room and just kind of assume it takes a massive step back as you lose guys like Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson. I think a lot of Florida State fans are kind of sitting there and saying, although there's not a ton of proven production in the pass catcher room for Florida State, the talent level is extremely high. And now I think the big question is, what talented wide receivers kind of emerged during fall camp to kind of solidify their role in this Florida State offense? I want to start with wide receiver Malik Benson. Now, you go back to the spring practice session, it sounds like Malik Benson is going to be our wide receiver one for Florida State. And you talk about upside. I don't know how many wide receivers across the country have the upside that Malik Benson has. You talk about the frame, then you talk about the 10-4 in the 100-meter dash. This was a kid that was extremely coveted coming out of JUCO. He goes to Alabama, doesn't get a ton of opportunity during the 2023 season at Alabama. I think that had a lot more to do with how that Alabama offense was constructed, as opposed to Malik Benson not being a good football player. From what you hear in spring camp, Malik Benson is going to be a guy for Florida State. I think he perfectly fits how DJU wants to operate at that quarterback spot, where we're going to attack the deeper third. We're going to let Malik Benson kind of be that vertical threat. We know that Mike Norvell schemes this offense and it's relying on explosive plays. I think Malik Benson can be one of those guys that is the explosive play wide receiver for DJU in this Florida State offense. I'm just interested to kind of hear, is he that true wide receiver one for Florida State? Certainly sounds like he's going to be. I think the next guy we got to talk about is Akeem Williams. You talk about the best possible scenario for Florida State in 2024. Florida State is to reach their potential in the 2024 season. I think that scenario includes Akeem Williams putting it together. And for a lot of Florida State fans, I think what you're most excited for is, look, we knew Akeem Williams wasn't going to be a year one guy. He was a raw freak athlete that played some low-level high school football. There was going to be an adjustment period. He was always going to be a year two guy for Florida State. So now the question is, you got a full another offseason under your belt, obviously spending some time in the weight room. Can Akeem Williams be a true impact wide receiver for Florida State during this 2024 season? We're going to hear a lot about Akeem Williams in fall camp. I think that might be the singular most important player to monitor for Florida State. You have a guy in Ja'Kai Douglas who is just kind of growing on me in terms of what he can be as that slot wide receiver. It sounds like he's kind of moving to that full-time slot wide receiver, a guy that if you can just scheme him up some touches and let him have the football in open space, he's a guy that is going to be a massive factor for Florida State. Now, we're going to get into Elijah Moore when we're predicting our breakout performers. Elijah Moore is a true freshman. I think he can be special. I think he can be special year one. We're going to talk about him in just a second. I think the second position battle that I'm looking at is at the linebacker room. And I think we know what our two starters are going to be, right? You have DJ Lundy coming back. He is going to be the guy. I think the heart and soul of this Florida State defense from that linebacker spot. And then Cam Riley coming in from Auburn. I think this was a massive get, because you look at this Florida State linebacker room. A lot of you guys have heard me say this. There was just not a ton of proven players in the linebacker room. We're excited about Justin Cryer. We're excited about Blake Nicholson. We're excited about Sean Murphy. None of those guys have played a ton of football at the Power 5 level. DJ Lundy and Cam Riley have. And so I think heading into fall camp, those are probably your two starting linebackers. What I'm kind of most excited to hear about is, hey, does Omar Graham look like a guy that Florida State can rely on? What about Blake Nicholson? What about Sean Murphy? Who's your linebacker 2, 3, 4 within this defense? Because you go back to last year, I mean, they rotated 3 linebackers pretty routinely within this Florida State offense. I would expect them to do the same. So who's linebacker 2, 3, and 4? I think it's a massive question mark for Florida State. Going to probably the most exciting conversation for me as it relates to fall camp, that's predicting breakout performers. And I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. I know every single Florida State fan has that one player that they can't wait to read the fall camp notes on. Let's start predicting some, breakout performers, guys that are going into maybe only year 1 or year 2, but guys that are going to break out during fall camp and kind of put a stamp on what they're going to mean to this Florida State program. I want to go back to a guy that we just talked about. That's Elijah Moore in the wide receiver room. Now, you don't know a ton about Elijah Moore because he was not within this program for spring practice. He got in the summer. Reading some of the summer workout stuff, Elijah Moore seems to be a guy. And we kind of knew he was a guy coming out of high school. I mean, he's 6'4.5", 200 pounds. He is physically ready to be a Division I college football player. Now, you look at Elijah Moore and say he's extremely gifted. He's got a massive catch radius. He makes some absolute circus catches. This is a kid that I think was grossly underrated in the 2024 class, and a guy that I think could really get some burn year 1 as a freshman because there's some opportunity to get involved in this Florida State offense. The next guy I want to talk about is in the running back room, and I'm going to kind of point to 2 guys. One, Cam Davis as a true freshman. Another guy that coming in as a freshman, similar to Elijah Moore, physically is absolutely ready to rock and roll. Now, how much opportunity is he going to get within this running back room? That's probably the question, kind of figuring out the pecking order of this Florida State running back room where you have so many good players that can do so many different things. Where does Cam Davis kind of stack up within that Florida State running back room? That's a fascinating question. I think the second one in the running back room is Jalen Lucas. We know Jalen Lucas is one of the most explosive players in all of the country. We think he's a perfect fit within Mike Norvell's offense, where you look at Mike Norvell and say, what makes Mike Norvell such an elite football coach? Not only he's just a locker room guy, he's a guy that is clearly changing the culture of this Florida State program. But more importantly, he knows how to use his personnel. And Jalen Lucas is a guy that you go back to Indiana, he's this dynamic playmaker that Indiana didn't really know how to use. I think Mike Norvell is going to know how to use him. Now, what I'm most excited for is where is Jalen Lucas getting used out of the backfield in the slot? This is a guy that's going to be I don't mean this in a bad way, but kind of a gadget guy within Florida State, kind of like what Ja'Kai Douglas did for Florida State the last couple of years. How is Jalen Lucas getting used within this Florida State offense? That's a question mark I have. Now, you go to the defensive side of the football, 2 guys that I want to keep an eye on. One, KJ Sampson. Now, Florida State fans, you guys have been lighting it up in the comments section about KJ Sampson. We loved him coming out of high school in that 2023 cycle. This is a massive storyline where you look at Joshua Farmer, Daryl Jackson Jr. We feel really good about what Florida State has in your starting interior defensive line. What made Florida State so special last year is they had guys like Braden Fisk, Fabian Lovett, Joshua Farmer that you could kind of just rotate and keep all those bodies fresh. My biggest question mark has nothing to do with Joshua Farmer and Daryl Jackson Jr. We think they're going to be really solid football players for Florida State. Who's your 2, 3, 4 on the inside of the defensive line? Grady Kelly, we feel pretty good about, has played a lot of football at Colorado State. Daniel Lyons would be another guy that, at least personally, I'm keeping an eye on in terms of how does he factor into the rotation. But KJ Sampson Jr., I think this is a guy that could possibly take that step going into year 2 of his college football career. And then Conrad Hussey. You look at Conrad Hussey, didn't have a ton of opportunity to play as a true freshman because of how good that Florida State secondary was. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's a chance that Conrad Hussey can take over that starting job at one of those safety positions. You have Shaheem Brown playing that buck. In terms of free safety, you talk about, again, best case scenario for Florida State, I think the best case scenario would be Conrad Hussey emerging as your starting safety throughout fall camp. And we know Mike Norvell and this Florida State staff loves this kid. They tried to play him as much as they could as a true freshman. Really excited about Conrad Hussey. And then going to, I think, the last question mark we have about Florida State in terms of fall camp storylines, that's the depth. There are a couple of positions that, and it's not always the flashiest conversation to have, but you talk about Florida State. What are their goals for the 2024 season? It's win the ACC title, make a run in the college football playoffs. You look at all the teams that have been able to win games in November and December and January. These teams are deep. And so not necessarily just focusing on who's going to be starting for Florida State, but there are certain position groups that we kind of have some question marks about the depth. We highlighted the linebacker spot, whether it's Blake Nicholson, whether it's Sean Murphy, Justin Cryer, Omar Graham Jr., who's going to step up and be those rotational linebackers within that Florida State linebacker room. I think the inside of the defensive line is certainly one of those things that you are looking at as well. And then you go to the offense, and I think I'm just looking at the offensive line where I think this unit is incredibly deep. You take a look at just the returning production and the amount of experience that they have on the offensive line. Outside of TJ Ferguson, every single projected starter for Florida State has played a ton of football, including some guys that are going to be in the two deep. Robert Scott Jr. or Keandre Jones. What does the Florida State rotation look like in your front five? I think every Florida State fan is just hoping this Florida State offensive line stays a little bit healthier so you don't have to rely as much on the depth and you can keep guys in your starting rotation for an extended period of time. You go back to last year, it was just a lot of rotation, not a ton of continuity because of the injury problems. I think this Florida State offensive line is deep. Now I'm kind of looking at what does that rotation look like on the offensive line. And outside of that, we've kind of said it. I think what is special about this Florida State team as opposed to last year, a lot of people writing this Florida State team off because they lost 10 guys to the NFL draft. Maybe Florida State doesn't have the top-end talent that it has last year, although I think there's certainly guys like A.Z. Thomas that could go top 20 in the NFL draft. I think this team is deeper at a lot of different positions than they were last year, which certainly matters, especially when you're trying to win football games late in November and in December. So I think this team is deep. And now you're just kind of keeping your ear to the fall camp notes, looking at, all right, who is kind of breaking out as those rotational pieces within this Florida State team. Those are my biggest storylines. Would love to hear from you guys as well. Again, we're going to talk a lot about this Florida State program as fall camp carries out. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section. Appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.